Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Asia House. I'm Michael Lawrence, and today our focus is on Digital India. And we're producing today's event in partnership with McKinsey, and this follows the launch of the McKinsey report, Digital India, Technology to Transform a Connected Nation. There are copies next door, so please, I advise you to grab one and take a look. It's an excellent piece of work. In a moment, we'll get a briefing on the report from Madgavkar, who is partner at McKinsey Global Institute. Some of the findings of the report, which I have gone through, and the analysis based on the findings really are quite staggering. Several struck me as worth highlighting at the very top of the program, just to give some context to the discussions we're going to have later on. And they are that in the next 5 years, India will be one of the world's largest data ecosystem. Digital themes across 9 national priority areas have the potential to create $1 trillion of economic value in India by 2025. India's digital economy can rise to become 20% of the total economy by 2025, and the digital economy could create something like 60 to 65 million jobs in that same time frame, although McKinsey does caution that this will require a significant amount of retraining and redeployment. So that gives a measure of the scale of the digital transformation in India over the next 5 years. And as I said, Anu, who's kindly flown in from India to join us, will give us a comprehensive briefing on this report in just a second. We're then going to broaden out the discussion with a panel featuring speakers from HSBC, from Pontac, and from Freshworks. We're keen to get you involved in the discussion, as always, at Asia House. I'll open up the sessions for questions, and we invite you to take part. But please now, let's welcome to the stage Anu Madgavkar from McKinsey.
Thank you, Michael, and a very good morning to everyone. It's absolutely wonderful to be here today and talk about what I think is a very exciting topic for India, as well as actually for the global economy and for people. But before diving in, I'd like to just start with one sort of very basic but important observation, and then a couple of quiz questions to see, just gauge the level of awareness in the room, let's say. So let's start with the observation. The observation is that from an individual standpoint, the ability to participate in a modern economy vitally depends on one very essential element, which is your ability to prove you are who you say you are. Economic interactions depend on trust. It depends on me knowing who my counterparty is, no matter what. If I look for a job or I seek a loan, I need to identify who I am. And the same is true in the digital economy. So therefore, when we think about opportunities and value creation and value capture in the digital economy, it's as crucially dependent on this idea of, can you actually identify who you are? And the facts really are that around the world, this is not necessarily a very obvious or ubiquitous phenomenon. There are about 1 billion people in the world today who have no means of identification at all. There are another 3.4 billion odd who have some means of identification, but no sort of access to digital devices or the online world. And then there are 3.2 billion who have ID, who have access to digital, but can't really operate in a very seamless way in the digital world. So this is important because in a developing country like India, one of the most important foundational elements is what we call good digital ID. And that means that you should be able to authenticate yourself in a high assurance way, with consent, with due respect for data privacy, but still be able to use an array of online services on the basis of being able to prove that you are who you say you are. I start with this because it's foundational, and now I come to the quiz question, the first quiz question. How many people in India, or what share, do we think actually have what we call good digital ID, this important foundational element? Anyone hazard a guess? Sure? 90%. Okay. Is that the consensus view? It's absolutely right. It's 90%, and this is actually extremely high. Not many economies in the world are at this stage. Estonia is one exception. And you see that even advanced economies, while everyone has some form of ID, not all advanced economies actually have the ability to give citizens or consumers the ability to identify themselves online in a very highly secure, high assurance format. The next question is, assuming you have digital ID, do you really have digital access, right? How many smartphone users does India have? C? C is close. I'm not going to repeat the well-informed person right at the back, but I got a reasonably close answer from the first row. So it's B. It's 350 million and growing, of course. And of course, China at almost 3 times the scale, and the US at about 300 million are the other counterparts. Assuming you are a smartphone user, an internet subscriber, how much are you actually using, right? What is the level of consumption in India in terms of GB per user per month? Where do we think India is? Okay, it's actually C. And one reason that sort of explains why this is so is that the cost of data has crashed. We think about it in terms of how expensive is it to buy data relative to monthly per capita income. And this has actually dropped from 10% of monthly per capita income for a minimum data plan down to as low as 0.1% in the last 3 years. So a mixture of competition, predatory pricing, and just sheer aggression, government policy that's actually enabled that. So India is one of the cheapest data environments, and consumers are lapping it up, right? Interestingly, China and South Korea are a little bit behind, and this number is actually rising again for India. And finally, quiz question number 4 is, what are people doing? This should be no surprise, let me reveal the answer. Indians are very sociable animals. We love to chat, we love to interact on social media, and the consumer-led digital leap has actually been met through, on the supply side, through the whole spectrum of social media, entertainment, recreation, and that's really wave 1 of what's happening in India. But of course, the digital India opportunity is much more than that, which we'll come to in a moment. So it's clear from this that if you compare India with a range of other economies, both advanced economies as well as developing ones, we looked at data across 30-odd indicators and created a sort of index of digital adoption. Not surprisingly, in terms of absolute level, India is or was very much at the bottom of this list. It's in its early stage of digital adoption. But in terms of acceleration, momentum, rate of growth, it's actually amongst the fastest and is even outstripping some of its emerging market counterparts in terms of just the speed of digital access across number of users, a level of usage, cost, government services that are online, and a whole bunch of other things. Now, for those who know India, we know that India isn't one country. It's more like a continent. I like to think about India as more like Europe than, let's say, China. There is huge diversity, economic, linguistic, cultural, across all parts of India. What is really interesting about the digital leap is that the blue band that you see is typically what you would consider less economically developed, lower per capita income. They are interior states, so they're quite rural, they're less urbanized. And these states have accounted for almost half the new internet subscribers that India's seen come on board in the last 3 years or so. These are the states with the fastest growing individual internet account users or usership, as well as this phenomenon which is a kind of shared access to the internet, which is also, I think, quite unique to India. There are about 400,000 common service centers, which are like digital kiosks. They're franchisees. They offer a menu of digital services to local communities. So even if you don't have access yourself or don't know how to use your mobile phone for the internet, you can actually go to a kiosk and get a bunch of services from them. And again, these are concentrated in the interior, less developed parts of India. One of the big implications of this is that 9 out of 10 new users don't actually speak English or can't read English. So the next big wave of innovation is going to be around local language. It's also true that the literacy levels are, functional literacy exists, but this is not a user base that's very comfortable with traditional text-heavy content the way you or I would be, and therefore formats like voice-based interaction, video-based interaction is going to be the future, right, in terms of these kinds of users. Now, the government of India is playing a very unique influencing and shaping role in India's digital evolution. I talked a little bit about digital ID, and Aadhaar is the program which now covers over 90% of all individuals. But it doesn't end with ID. They've built a stack of services on top of the digital ID platform that actually allows things like person-to-person payments, eKYC, which means bank accounts or payment accounts or loan accounts can actually be authenticated remotely via a biometric swipe without complicated documentation. You can actually buy or subscribe to a mobile connection on the basis of eKYC. E-sign is digital verification and signature for documents. And then this thing called DigiLocker, which means that everyone in India knows we love paper, and you always have to produce some kind of certificate or document for just about everything. Well, DigiLocker actually provides a digitally verified, government-certified document that you can show somebody on your phone, and that's another capability built on top of the Aadhaar stack. So many of these are quite transformational potentially, and we therefore see India going through a triple whammy. I like to call it a triple whammy because there are three kind of perspectives to this, or engines running, right? The first is the government's betting big, not just on building the core foundation that we talked about, but making this useful to people. So 360 million Jan Dhan accounts. These are kind of zero balance, no frill accounts. They've gotten opened. All these accounts, plus another 500 million more accounts, are actually linked to your eID, your digital ID. And these are being used to transfer benefits directly to people and avoid leakages and avoid fraud. So this is a huge sort of incentive for people to actually get online, to get smart about, how can I access these services. 10 million businesses are now on a digital platform for indirect tax payments, for value-added tax on the GST network. Another 67 million do digital tax filing. Farms are actually, the government's actually issued more than 200 million soil health cards, which monitor agricultural quality across hundreds of millions of farms, and that data is being digitized. And similarly, government procurements are moving online, and there's a slew of other, there's literally like a policy a month. Sometimes it feels like you go a little backwards because regulation's trying to catch up with what innovation's permitting, but the government's very, very active on this front. So this is really the first of the three whammies, right? The second is the excitement that we're seeing from the startups and digital natives ecosystem in India, which I think a lot of people are aware of. What's interesting about this is the variety and types of startups. So in logistics, for example, or in the trucking business, you have marketplaces being created and achieving significant scale. You have IoT in trucks that are actually helping companies to optimize their trucking routes, but also helping truck drivers optimize their hours on duty so that they can actually go home and sleep at home as opposed to being on the road all the time. So really interesting sort of side benefits to users coming out of some of these innovations. Farm advisory is another big one. The largest B2B unicorn, one of the largest B2B unicorns in the world, actually makes its living by looking at mobile-based data and offering all sorts of services to other businesses on the back of mobile data that they capture from consumers. And of course, ride-hailing and ride-sharing is moving into a big ecosystem of its own. The third and most exciting of these digital innovation examples is really the incumbent companies. Now, you would not normally think that a 50-year-old or a 100-year-old company that's used to doing business in a very traditional way is actually at the forefront of digital innovation, but we are seeing that in India. The largest bank in India, the State Bank of India, has also sponsored an e-commerce ecosystem using, State Bank of India payment products, but signing up with a whole set of retailers to actually allow you to do whatever you want in that ecosystem. The largest construction company in India is doing something radical, which is across 400 construction project sites around the country, in the most remote and inhospitable parts of the country, they have digitized and wired up each project site and are able to know exactly how much sand or clinker is coming in, what wages need to be paid to contract labor, all sorts of things to drive up productivity based on digitization in a sector like construction, which is so heavily physical, right? A 70-year-old auto and truck company that's built new businesses in things like spare parts, service, et cetera, with a digital-first mindset. A hospital chain that's betting big on teleconsultation. And some of the largest online lending businesses actually sponsored by established industrial groups. So lots of innovation amongst some of these leaders. And on the back of all of these three forces, we think, Michael talked a little bit about this, but we just think that the data ecosystem that will flourish out of India is really poised to explode on the back of greater access, but also the supply side catching up. So lots more innovation in terms of what consumers will do other than chat and use social media. Very quickly, across different ecosystems, I do want to underscore the point around the combination of government enablers and private sector innovation. This is a common theme, and not always do they operate in complete lockstep. I think around the world, governments struggle with how much to allow and how much to control and regulate. And there are always considerations about, do we need to protect incumbents and things like that? But there are a set of very enabling policies. Just to give you one example, in e-commerce, for example, what the government is trying to do is to create the India Post postal network as a kind of last mile logistics provider for e-commerce companies. And that's just one example. We're seeing that across the board. I talked a little bit about agriculture and in job seeking and talent platforms as well. The government actually has a policy to help people register on some of these job portals and actually seek job opportunities. And the vision going forward is in a set of key areas to build what we call public digital platforms. Now, this is potentially something, again, unique to India. We've seen the rise of digital platforms like, let's say, the Alibaba ecosystem or Facebook and Google. Most of platform creation has actually been a private sector function in most parts of the world. The government in India really wants to say that, can we aggregate all of this data that we are actually helping generate, and can we put it in a format that is actually interoperable, supports a lot of other applications and innovations from the private sector, but we create this platform more as a social or public good platform that then, based on consent and certain rules and so on, innovators can actually use to provide services to people. So some of this work is underway, some of it is actually planned, but there is this notion of, how do we aggregate data for public good, which is quite interesting. And we think across these 9 areas, I'm not going to go into all these opportunities, but suffice it to say that it's not just the traditional, what we think about as IT, India's IT-enabled services is well known as sort of a big engine of value creation, but it's actually across the whole economy that digital transformation will actually unfold. And many of these themes we are seeing as small pilots or examples on the ground, but they really have the opportunity to scale up. If they do, based on the potential at least, we think that there's enormous value that can be created. Now, when we say value, we don't mean revenue, we don't mean profits, we don't even necessarily mean GDP, but economic value in the form of higher productivity, higher savings. Not all of this may be monetized. Some of it may go back to consumers as consumer surplus. So if I save time because I don't have to stand in a queue to see a doctor, but I can actually book my consultation online, That time comes to me. It may not translate into GDP, but that's consumer benefit. So economic value comprises all of these things, and it may get distributed in different ways to those who innovate or those who use, and so on. But it's still, if you aggregate it, it could be 20% of the economy out in 2025 or 2030. And it's going up from a base. Currently, it's, I think, about 7% of the economy is what you can call digital. And it will permeate not just the traditional digital-first sectors, but a whole range of new sectors that include areas like logistics or agriculture, for example. What does it mean for jobs? This is potentially the most complicated and difficult challenge for, I think, any set of policymakers. We think that technology fundamentally transforms work. That's what it does. You can't argue with that. So there is a 40 to 45 million worker effect of people who will need retraining and redeployment. But the job opportunities or the work opportunities that technology creates are also very profound, might exceed this. And they are across the skill spectrum. So you think about the food ordering app and the fact that now you have a whole army of these last mile delivery executives, as they're called, bringing food to people's doorsteps. They have to be digitally savvy enough to understand, their order and how to navigate themselves. But it's a new professionalized form of doing work that was very fragmented and very informal. So it actually provides, I think, a new form of dignity to many of these workers. They are actually part of an ecosystem or a value chain that is organizing them, skilling them, providing payments in a more formal context as compared to what they might be doing elsewhere. The other thing about work is that there is a knowledge gap in many parts of India. Like, you don't have agricultural know-how available where you need it. But if you create a digital value chain where a lot of the thinking and design can happen remotely with the help of technology and AI, but you still need the arms and legs, the hands on the street or on the ground to actually interact with the user. So by kind of splitting the work, and you're actually enabling a worker on the ground to be more empowered and more effective and not be inhibited by the skill gaps that he or she may have. The final point, are businesses ready? So we ran a survey in which we tried to assess the digital readiness of businesses to adapt and take advantage of all these opportunities. And what we found is, of course, there's a spectrum. This is an indexed score, and you see the score actually varies by sector, but within any given sector, you have digital leaders and digital laggards. So it's not like a sector is hamstrung or handicapped simply because it's an old world sector. There is digital innovation happening there. And similarly, there are laggards to be found everywhere. And the gap between the businesses who are digital leaders and digital laggards is actually quite stark across elements like prioritizing digital as part of your core strategy, making sure you're spending enough, creating a consolidated or centralized team because the resources are very hard. The intellectual resources to do this are actually very limited. So you do need to consolidate and make your limited analytics or digital capabilities available to the whole organization. And then you do need to think about a portfolio of real capabilities to build. So that gap is quite large. And in conclusion, therefore, the sort of what's needed to capture this opportunity. I mean, lots of things are needed, but in summary, right? From a business standpoint, I think it's about the approach to capability building, which is going to be critical. This is not easy, and the skills aren't sort of available everywhere. How do you really think about the right portfolio, what I need to do now versus a few big bets for the future? For governments, I think ensuring smooth transitions while coming up with policies that protect privacy, that protect individual rights and data, but also allow innovation to happen. And then for individuals, wherever you are in the world, not just in India, it really is about anticipating that work is going to get disrupted. You need to reinvent, reskill. It's a lifelong learning. And I think the challenges to make this happen in India are not trivial, but the opportunity or the prize is also not trivial. It's actually huge and quite attractive. So with that, I'll stop, and let's hope we have a nice conversation.